Yes, come back on.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third in our series, the sort of midpoint in our series of lectures exploring various aspects of the Venerable Bede. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Peter Darby from, well, he's from Nottingham University, but he's Durham Mafia really, as he's a Durham graduate. He's established himself as one of the leading Bede scholars of his generation, and among other things has published some seminal papers on aspects of the Codex Amiatinus, which is a subject dear to the hearts of the Friends of the World of Bede, having raised all that money for the full facsimile, and has also just co-edited with another of our lecturers in this series, Dr. Maureen McCarran, a new volume of essays on Bede called Bede the Scholar, which actually I haven't physically seen it. I have snuck a look at the bit you can get for free on the web, but I haven't actually done it properly yet. And his current research project is on Northumbrian letters in the age of Bede, and of course Bede is the principal content, no doubt, of that topic, and that's what he's going to focus on for us this morning, on Bede's letters. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Peter, to speak to us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Where do I need to stand? Am I okay?
That's fine,
yeah.
Okay.
Well, we tried this, and I tried to find anybody who could...
I think they're at the back. I'll have a look.
Is it either all on or all off? Is that the problem?
Well,
you just can't see the screen.
yeah, I mean, the problem was actually just finding exactly how they worked. But we can have a go. At least dimming might be.
It's a nice, very bright as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean...
Better?
Yeah, that is... so, yeah, I mean, stand as you please. I know it feels a bit remote.
No, I'll stay.
I mean, just one.
To try and avoid that big bright light in my eyes.
Yeah, well, there is that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I just want to start by saying thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you and hosting me in this lecture series. I'm delighted to be here, really. It's always a real pleasure to come back to the North East and to support the museum and its public engagement activities. And particularly thank you to Erin Cambridge for inviting me to return to this very special place. And thanks to all of you for finding the time to be here as well. So, as already mentioned, what I want to do today is talk to you about the letters of Bede, and this is part of a wider project of a wide project that I'm working on to do with Northumbrian letters. So it's not just the book that I write at the moment, not just Bede, but it encompasses his contemporaries as well. But a large portion of the evidence, as Eric mentioned, is obviously Bede's letters themselves. So his letters make up about half of the corpus that I'm looking at. And the end result will be a book on the letter writing culture of Northumbria. So I'm investigating the epistolary culture of Northumbria in the age of Bede, by which I mean the period of the kingdom's conversion to Christianity through the 7th and 8th centuries, a period often described as Northumbria's golden age. And in a sense, this was also a golden age of letter writing, although we don't have a huge amount of letters to survive from the period. The ones that we do have are really, really interesting and show that Northumbrians, like Bede, were very well versed in the sort of classical and late antique techniques of letter writing. So this was a period of great change in many ways. The coming of Christianity brought with it book culture and writing culture, and it allowed letters in particular, allowed the kingdom's religious and secular elites, in some cases, to communicate with people beyond the kingdom, communicate with the wider world. So we have examples of letter writing within Northumbria, but also letters linking Northumbrian authors to the continent, places like Rome and Mainz, other Southumbrian kingdoms, Ireland, and the Pictish kingdoms as well. So it's a really important but understudied aspect of the kingdom's development at this time. And so it allows Northumbrians to access the wider world of Latin learning. So letter writing makes long-distance communications much safer, and it also makes those communications possible. So it's about building and expanding relationships and networks. So Bede's letters are a huge part of the project, as are other figures that you will no doubt be familiar with: Chelfrith, Wakeburn and Cuthbert, the abbots of Wearmouth and Jarrow, and others as well. Alcuin is another Northumbrian author to write a lot of letters in this period. I'm going all the way up to 786, so 50 years or so after the death of Bede, and I chose that date as a cut-off point because that's the year in which Alcuin leaves York permanently to move to Charlemagne's court on the continent. And taking 786 as a cut-off point gives a total corpus of 35 letters, of which 19 of those were by Bede. So his letters make up half of that total corpus and are clearly very important indeed. Now, what I want to do in the book is to sort of define and establish the distinctive nature of the culture of letter writing in Northumbria that Bede was central to, and situate it within its range of influences, which are many. The culture is influenced by the classical period, late antiquity, also contemporary influences as well. And I'll touch on some of that in the second half of the talk today. But the kind of societies that were influencing Northumbria at this time include Rome, Merovingian Francia, the Southumbrian kingdoms and Ireland, as well as biblical and late antique patristic works as well. So it's really, like so many other aspects of Northumbria's culture at that time, a real melting pot of influences that come together to create something distinctive and unique in some ways. So I want to talk today about some of the key principles that underpin letter writing at this time, focusing on Bede himself, and then I want to talk in the second part of the talk about a particular exchange of letters that was between Bede and Bishop Acca. Acca of Hexham was the diocesan bishop responsible for Wearmouth and Jarrow, and he was emerged as one of Bede's major patrons throughout this period. And what we have with Acca is the survival. It's very rare in this period actually to have both sides of a letter exchange. There's only sort of 2 or 3 examples where we have the outgoing and the incoming letter as well. But one of them is this exchange between Bede and Acca. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it shows some of the techniques that the writers in this time used when talking to each other through the written word. So the kind of techniques that Bede was using were no means unique to him. Okay, so the evidence is weighted in favour of him because of the fame of Bede and the sort of the success of his works. But the other letters that we have, often just one letter per individual, show that others were involved in this culture as well. So one example is Elfled of Whitby. Elfled was the abbess of Whitby in succession to Hild. And we have one letter surviving from Elfled from the period to a figure called Adola of Falsall, another abbess on the continent. And what that shows is that she was also able to deploy the same kinds of elusive techniques that we'll see with Bede and Acca in the second part of the talk. It also proves that women were involved in letter writing in this period, had training in the same way as male figures did, and could be equally as adept at deploying the techniques that they've learned as their male counterparts. It's not common for people to think about Bede as a letter writer, but the letters are crucially important to understanding him and his relationship with the wider world. Bede was of course famous across Europe for his ecclesiastical history of the English people, and also the hagiographical, the saints' lives, and the historical writings as well. And the letters are well known, but they do tell us an awful lot about how Bede built this reputation for himself. And one of the things I want to stress today is that Bede did all of this without any formal position of elevated authority within the church. So we know that Bede was a priest, was a monk, first a deacon and then a priest, but he was never an abbot, he was never a bishop, he was never an archbishop or anything of that nature. And actually it's quite unusual for somebody of such comparatively low status to be able to write letters at all in this period. All of the other examples that we have are from abbots, bishops, it's just see if it comes back, royalty and other figures like that. So, and another thing to mention is the monastic rules of this period, such as the rule of St. Benedict, expressly forbid the sending and receiving of letters by monks without the express permission of their abbot. So Bede is, as so often when studying him, he's a special case and an unusual figure in that regard. In the 19th century, the editors of the Patrologia Latina series reprinted transcriptions of a group of Bede's letters. So there is an edition of Bede's letters. It's very old and it's unsatisfactory in some ways. But despite that, the correspondence has never been studied as a group before. Some individual letters, I'll mention some on the next slide in a moment, have attracted virtually no scholarly attention at all. And so there's a lot to sort of learn from looking at this material. The scholarship, Bede scholarship in the 20th century, late 20th century, was revolutionised really by people starting to study the biblical commentaries in much more depth than they ever had done before. And so the scholarship underwent a sort of exegetical turn that really revolutionised our understanding of Bede himself as a scholar, but also the historical works themselves. And people look at the corpus of writing as kind of a whole with lots of interrelationships between it. So what Bede was doing in one type of work was not necessarily distinct from what he was doing in another type. But the letters, again, have not really been brought into this, so that's one of the things that I'm trying to achieve. Okay, can we move the slide on, please? Finally, right. Okay, so the starting point for any study of Bede's letters is this passage. This is from the last chapter of Book 5, the last book of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, Book 5, Chapter 24. And it's a section of the Ecclesiastical History where Bede tells us about himself, short statement saying that he lived in the monastery here, and those kinds of things. And then he lists all of his writings he gives a comprehensive list of his writings, and that list is really interesting. First come the biblical commentaries, arranged in canonical order, so the commentary on Genesis is first, the commentary on Revelation is last, even though the commentary on Revelation was the first of Bede's commentaries, so it's not ordered chronologically, it's thematic. And scholars have often taken, it's been sort of a commonplace of the scholarship for a long time for people to say, well, the fact that the biblical commentaries come first in this list shows the importance they had in Bede's mind. So he's presenting himself to posterity. He's presenting himself as a scriptural scholar first and foremost. And the histories, the hagiographies, the works that people tend to know much better, they only come later in this list. Now this statement is actually, if you think thematically of categories, so biblical commentaries, histories, hagiographies, educational works on time, the entry on the letters is actually the second category to come. So for Bede, that suggests that they were relatively important in his mind, coming only after the biblical commentaries in the ordering of this list. Okay? And he describes this book of letters that he's published as a book of letters to various people, one on the 6 ages of the world, one on the resting places of the children of Israel, one on the words of Isaiah, and then one on the reason for the leap year, and one on the equinox. Okay, so there's 5 published letters that Bede regarded as part of his public-facing writings that he wanted people to know that he'd done. And interestingly, this is ordered chronologically. If we take the dates of each one of these individual letters, the chronological sequencing of those is established. So he was thinking in terms of what he'd done at different stages of his career. So the inclusion of the letters in the list suggests that that book of letters was part of Bede's established canon, and that he wanted people reading the ecclesiastical history to know that he was a letter writer. The letter to Whitted, this is the one on the equinox after Anatolius, the last one mentioned, that survives, there's 30 manuscripts of that survive, so that's circulated quite widely in the Middle Ages. But if you take that away, the other 4 letters are covered by just 6 manuscripts, so not 6 manuscripts each, but 6 manuscripts in total witness the other 4 standalone letters there mentioned in the Liber Epistolarum. So I mentioned that just to say, in contrast, the ecclesiastical history survives in more than 100 manuscripts. The reckoning of time is a similar number. Some of the biblical commentaries, the New Testament ones, survive in 100 or nearly 100 manuscripts. So it suggests that people in the Middle Ages also perhaps didn't think of Bede as a letter writer either, because there was not a practice of kind of copying and circulating his works in the same way that there was for the ecclesiastical history and those other texts already mentioned. So if we don't, modern scholars don't think of Bede as a letter writer, this may well be because, this perception of Bede as not being a letter writer or as not being part of his scholarship that people emphasise, this may have a long heritage going all the way back through the Middle Ages. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So it's important to say, though, that slide, the list that I just showed you, doesn't present the sum total of Bede's correspondence. You may have heard me say earlier in the talk that there are actually 19 letters of Bede to survive, so there's another 14, and I'll show you what those are in a moment. This raises questions. There's 19 different letters, five summarised in one paragraph, and then 14 different ones. Raises questions of what actually is a letter. And I've got Jerome's Epistle 53 on the slide here, just as an example to suggest that letters were very, very variable and varied text type in the Middle Ages. We can have sort of short communications between people, or they could be really quite long theological treatises. This is a very famous letter that was known to Bede and is actually really important in the Codex Amiatinus. It's there as a text, but it's also there presented visually in various diagrams as well. And this originated as a letter from Jerome to Paulinus of Nola. What it offers, or part of it offers, is a book-by-book guide to the typological relationship of the Old and New Testaments. So there's a section on Genesis, a short statement on Exodus, and so on and so forth, all the way through the Bible. Really, really influential. Bede knew this. He cites it. He cites it in his own letters and in his own writing several times. And this letter takes on an afterlife of its own. It becomes incorporated into the canon of the Vulgate by the Carolingians, and it's sometimes still printed in certain Bibles to this day. And I mention it as an example because all the way through its history, it never loses its identity as a letter. And even here, this is from one of the Gutenberg Bibles, and at the top it says the beginning of a letter from Jerome to Paulinus of Nola. So it retains its identity as a letter, even though really what it becomes is a theological treatise, a key for unlocking the scriptures, in a sense. Okay, next slide, please. So it's important then, in working with this material, to think about what is a letter and what is not a letter. It's not as straightforward as you might think. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this because it's obviously important for my project. One of the things I'm doing in my project is a detailed appendix that sort of categorises all the different letters from this period and offers information about them. So I've thought about this quite a lot. I've got working definition, but I think this is my final definition of what a letter is in this period. And I'll just go through that carefully now. So I'm defining letter as a text that is in which one party directly addresses another. And I've used parties rather than people because sometimes we'll have, often it's one individual writing to another, but sometimes we might have two people writing to one. We might have one person writing to a group. We might have one person addressing all Christians in England. There's lots of different combinations. So one party to another. The text must make use of first-person parts of speech, so it's written in one's own voice, whether that's, that would be a combination of first-person pronouns and verbs in the first person, singular or plural, depending on, again, how many people are writing to how many other people. And then finally, there's lots of texts that meet 1 and 2, but the thing that sort of defines something as a letter in particular is that it must have one or more recognisable epistolary features. Now, there is a way of writing a letter that is developed in classical antiquity and transmitted through the Middle Ages, through late antiquity, and was known to the Northumbrians and emulated by the Northumbrians. And there's a structure for letter writing that is very, very clearly defined and is pretty much ubiquitous across the letters of the period. This ultimately derives from, it originates with guidelines for the preparation of public speeches from Cicero, and then it becomes sort of blended into letter writing culture, and it becomes the set way of writing a letter that is followed through the Middle Ages, all the way, long after Bede's time as well. And so there's a sort of a method of persuasion, a method of presentation. Now, the most obvious and recognisable epistolary feature is a salutation, and that is the greeting clause of the letter, in which it will typically say something like, to the most beloved and venerable Bishop Acker, Bede the priest sends greetings. Okay, so there'll be a couple of superlatives in there, and the other set features of this would be that the recipient's name always comes before the sender's, and then the final word is normally salutem, the greeting word in Latin. And in most cases, there'll be a salutation present, so we can say that is definitely a letter because there's a clear epistolary salutation there. Sometimes, if the salutation isn't there, there may be a valediction, which is, again, a very formulaic way of ending a letter that would say something like, farewell, beloved friend, and please remember to pray for us. There's normally some, in the letters of this period, some reference and request for people to pray for one another. And if both of those are missing, which is quite rare, but it does happen, another way of identifying a letter is to follow through those other sections that are determined by the epistolary norms of the period. So a letter will begin with an exordium, which is a sort of an introductory statement which is designed to sort of flatter and curry favour with the recipient, often quite florid language, often use of superlatives there as well. The narration is where the letter says the reason for writing, what's happened, if it's reporting some news, that kind of thing. The petition is where you ask them for what you want, so please send me some manuscripts of the writings of Bede or something like that. And then the conclusion is a sort of a stylistically pleasing way of rounding the letter off and bringing it to a close. So sometimes, if the two most obvious features are missing, you can see that it's been written according to this structure. Now the next one, please. So these are the letters of Bede. 19 examples, as already mentioned. And I'm going to just explain what some of these are. I'm going to start with Group A. So I've separated them into two groups because Group A are what we would probably think of as real letters. The technical term is letters missive, which means the letter that was written and actually sent from one person to another. Okay? That's separate from Group B, and Group B is made up of epistolary prefaces. So it's common in this period for somebody beginning a work to start it with a letter, perhaps dedicating that work to somebody else. Bede often does this to Bishop Acker, as you can see from the items on the list. So they are real letters in the sense that they were written according to epistolary norms and they meet all of the criteria that I just outlined, but they were unlikely to have been sent from one person to another as a physical letter in the same sense that the ones in Group A were. So in Group A, the first five are those that are mentioned by Bede in the Liber Epistolarum, the slide that I had a few moments ago, describing his own book of letters. So that's numbers 1 to 5. 6 and 7 weren't mentioned in the ecclesiastical history because they were both written after its publication. The ecclesiastical history is usually associated with the year 731 for its completion. The letter to Egbert was 734. The letter to Albinus was probably slightly later than that as well. Okay, so we have a group of 7 real letters. The ones, and those are really interesting because they cover an accusation of heresy, they cover a doctrinal dispute, they cover the campaign to try and create a second archbishopric in England and York, and certain things like that. Now, Group B are the epistolary prefaces, and these are letters that are attached to individual works of various types, whether they're educational works, saints' lives, or most commonly biblical commentaries. The most famous is number 19, which is the letter to King Ceolwulf, that is the preface to the ecclesiastical history, which again is a really, really important text, but it's never really been studied as a letter first and foremost. And we can learn quite a lot of interesting things about Bede from it. It's the only letter that Bede wrote to a secular recipient. Okay, so this letter to King Ceolwulf, all of the rest of the letters were written to clerics of some form or another. What this slide does show is that Bede's communicated with a range of different people, so he has a network that we can reconstruct here. All of these people, apart from one, were Northumbrians. The exception is probably number 4, Helmwold, Bede says in that letter that he's separated from Helmore by large distances of land and sea. It's not impossible that that could be a Northumbrian recipient, you know, at the other end of the kingdom, but it's likely it's somebody either in Southumbria or on the continent, or perhaps Ireland, I suppose. The rest of them are all Northumbrian. They're all Northumbrian. So his epistolary network was largely confined to the kingdom itself. But this again is a good way of demonstrating the versatility of the letter from this period. We have lots of different types of letter represented on the slide. Can I have the next one, please? Okay. It's worth also pointing out, before proceeding, that 19 letters is not a huge amount for a figure of Bede's magnitude and importance. This may again be because of his status of not having a formal position of authority from which to be writing these letters. So 19 over a career, I mean, Bede's career as a writer goes from 703 to 735, so we're talking just over 30 years, 19 letters to survive over a 30-year career as a prominent writer is not a huge amount. By comparison, Gregory the Great at the top, Pope Gregory the Great, 854 letters, Augustine, more than 249, and an interesting comparison is Alcuin at the bottom, Alcuin of York, 300 letters, but all but 2 of those letters are thought to have been written after Alcuin left Northumbria to go and join the court of Charlemagne on the continent. So Bede kind of sits towards the bottom of that league table, if we want to think about it like that. And the difference, one of the differences is that Gregory and Augustine, they had a back-end machinery of people archiving and preserving and copying their ingoing and outgoing correspondence, in the case of Augustine. With Gregory, that's the papal archives, the papal archivists, and there was a concerted effort within Gregory's lifetime, but also then a century or two later, to gather all of Gregory's letters together into volumes and preserve them. With Augustine, this was done by his friends and his colleagues and students, both in his lifetime and afterwards as well. So there's nothing like that, it seems, at Weymouth and Jarrow. It's possible that some evidence has been lost, but I think that's probably quite unlikely. I think that the sum total of letters that we have from Bede, it's hard to say, but I don't think we're talking about hundreds of letters that have been lost. There may be a few, but he's certainly not as prolific as those other figures. And Bede's letters survive. You know, the ones in Group B, they survive because they survive in connection with the works they're attached to. And the survival of medieval letters, I'll have the next slide please, could be a matter of chance or fortune. The letters can be quite sort of their moment texts, where they might be describing something that's taken place that, you know, days, weeks, months later might not be relevant anymore. So there's not an inbuilt, unless there's kind of a reason, like with Gregory and Augustine, for wanting to preserve their letters, there's not an inbuilt tendency for archivists to copy them and keep them. An example of the sort of the elements of chance that apply to medieval letters is this one. This is a really important document. It was sent by Bishop Walderer of London, so it's a Southumbrian letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, in the years 704 to 705. So this was being written just as Bede was starting to establish himself as a writer. Bede would just have finished his commentary on Revelation at this time. He was just made priest in 703. And this is a really interesting document. It's just about, sort of just a little bit more than A4 wide and about 15 centimetres long. So it's a short and fat piece of parchment. So yeah, just a bit bigger than that A4 that way, and then down to about there, I would say. And this survives in the British Library in its original form. So this is an original letter, Southumbrian letter, from Bede's lifetime. And from this, there's a really important study of this letter by a scholar called Pierre Chapelet. And what it shows is it reconstructs the method of folding and how it was folded down into a very, very small package, a tenth of its size. How it was tied, the address label that's on the back. It's the only one of its type, but it's really important because it shows us what some of Bede's everyday letters the ones in Group A, what some of those, the shorter ones like the letter to Albinus, might have looked like in its physical form. You can see as well, it's written in a cursive hand. It's a functional document, it's not a presentation document. If you compare this to pages that you've seen of the Codex Amiatinus in the uncial script and the 2 parallel columns, and loads of space, empty parchment around there to make it really look visually very nice. There's none of that going on here. And I mentioned this one, well, one, because it's important, but two, because it was discovered in the Canterbury archives in the 12th century by an archivist there, who labelled it as Epistola Inutilis, which just means useless letter. But it's far from useless as a historically for us because of what it tells us about the materiality of these letters. But what the archivist meant was that the contents that it describes is, a bishop writing to another bishop. There's been some trouble with the king, and he's not sure whether to attend the synod or not because, he's looking for guidance from his metropolitan as to what to do. So it relates to a sort of dispute that was of its time but had no relevance to Canterbury in the 12th century. But regardless of labelling it as a useless letter, it was preserved there and has come down through the Middle Ages to us. And it helps give a sense of what a letter in this period actually looked like. Now with the Northumbrian ones, there's nothing like this to survive. They all survive in later copies, but some of the later copies do record some original features like address labels and things like that as well. So putting those two things together, we can get a sense of what the material properties of letters at this time were. Okay, next slide, please. So there must have been some letters of Bede's that have been lost, and we do occasionally, the technical term for this is deperdito in letter scholarship, and we do occasionally get references to lost letters. This is one example here, when Acca was writing to Bede. He says, "I've often suggested to your holy brotherhood, both in writing, when absent, and through conversation in person." So it implies that there are letters going back and forth between these two. A lot of letters survive from Bede to Acca, but only one back the other way. So there's sort of suggestion here that Acca was writing more than what we have access to. Okay, and there are other references to lost letters in some of Bede's letters as well. Now Acca's letter, this letter here that Acca writing to Bede between 710 and 716, survives along with Bede's reply as a twin epistolary preface to Bede's commentary on Luke. Okay? Now that's incredibly rare to have, as I said already, an exchange of letters where we have both sides of it. And it's therefore also this letter is really important as the only example of a letter to come down to us that Bede received. So he must have received plenty of letters, but this is the only one, just because of the circumstances of it being included in the commentary of Luke. This is the only one to survive. And one thing we can get here, from the way Acca is kind of describing his correspondence with Bede, is a sense, which again comes from late antiquity, church fathers like Augustine, Jerome, that letters represent a form of ongoing conversation between people, which allows that conversation to continue even when people are not always able to meet in person. So letters are one aspect of communication, complemented by others like face-to-face conversation, and also the exchanging of gifts. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? We've got, okay, great. Now, lots of recent work on Bede's biblical commentaries has looked at the influences upon his scholarship, and the emphasis there has mostly fallen upon patristic authorities. The letters allow us to see something slightly different, and I did at one point with this book I'm doing, think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an appendix of all of the letters that we know that Bede had access to at Wearmouth and Jarrow. Now the library here was incredible. It was probably surpassed 50 years later by the one at York, but of its time, there was nothing like it in this country, and it was the rival of lots of the great continental libraries as well. So it was massive through the work of Benedict Biscop and Shelford, building up the collections. And so I started trying to think of reconstructing, well, what actual letters would Bede have had access to? And letters are embedded in so many different types of work. This job just became so massive it was impossible. There's a huge amount of letters that Bede would have been able to come across in the Wearmouth Jarrow Library. So I've given up on trying to do that, but what I can say is that there's a huge range of different types of letters from lots of different time periods as well. So in terms of individual writers, again, this is the tip of the iceberg. Aldhelm is one of Bede's contemporaries from Northumbria, the Kingdom of Wessex. Augustine, who I've mentioned, another North African writer, Cyprian of Carthage, Dionysius Exiguus, that's to do with time reckoning, and some classical stuff, Horace, Jerome, I've mentioned already, Leo the Great, Pope Leo the Great, and then other figures, Lucian, Pelagius. The list sort of is not endless, but it does go on and on and on. Plus there's also the letters of Gregory and other popes, which we know Bede had because he includes them in the ecclesiastical history. The Bible itself is a repository of letters. The obvious ones, the Pauline epistles, Catholic epistles, but less obvious ones, there are letters embedded in the book of Acts, chapter 15, the book of Esther, chapter 30, and also the book of Revelation itself is presented in scripture as a letter. So Bede would have had access to all of this stuff. With regards to time reckoning, which Bede was an expert in the science of computus, that whole discipline relied upon the exchanging of letters and the circulation of old letters at this time in the Middle Ages. And I've highlighted Augustine and Paul. Paul was the most important influence on Augustine, and Augustine was the most important influence on Bede as a letter writer. So I'll give some examples soon, but lots of what Bede was doing was taking phrases, salutations, all sorts of things from Augustine's letters and then repurposing them and making them his own. And so that chain of Paul in the Bible, St. Augustine and Bede is really important. Sort of Paul obviously directly influenced Bede as well, but that's kind of the most important influences on Bede are Augustine and Paul. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. So I'm going to talk in the last 10 minutes or so about this Bede accurate exchange that I've mentioned a few times. The last slide before I get there is this one on practicalities. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, what the mechanics were that underpinned sending and receiving letters in this period. Now, the Romans had a system for this called the cursus publicus, in which there was a sort of a whole system, a bit like a postal service, the delivery service. It wasn't just for the sending of letters, but sending and receiving documents and letters was part of it. And there are similar things in the Byzantine world at this time. The Carolingians, slightly later than Bede, developed a system of administration that facilitates the exchange of documents. But in Northumbria, they didn't have anything like that. So sending a letter was done on an ad hoc and irregular basis. There's no delivery service, there's no postal service. So what you have to do if you are trying to send a letter to Bede is that you would have to find a messenger, you'd have to equip that messenger with the resources required for the journey. That might involve boats and horses, various types of equipment. Messengers often travelled in twos or in larger parties, so the costs for that would multiply. It wasn't a straightforward thing. You'd also need to have access to permissions to travel through different territories, especially if you go into the continent. You need to access a network of hospitality that the messenger would have along the way. Various resources as well. So these journeys needed to be planned, and they could only be undertaken really on an ad hoc basis. What this leads to is the practice of letter batching, whereby somebody will find out, okay, that person's going to Rome, oh, will you take this letter to this person on the way? So one messenger could carry multiple letters, but what it means is that those letters may have just been written because the occasion had arrived to get a letter to somebody on the continent, rather than because they necessarily needed to write to them for some urgent matter of pressing business. Letters often were accompanied by gifts, so especially some of the later Northumbrian letters, the later 8th century ones, there's references to people sending gifts to one another, often manuscripts, but sometimes fine textiles, gold rings, cloaks, otterskin cloaks, knives, this kind of thing. So gift exchange and letter exchange go hand in hand in this period. And Bede's ability, these practicalities have implications for Bede, because his ability to participate in these endeavours was limited by his status and probably by his means as well. Okay, so it's fighting abbots and bishops can write to each other, no problem, but for Bede that's a different kind of thing. It would have to be facilitated by his abbot, whether it's Wakefield or Chelfrith or whoever. And actually the rule of Benedict tells us that letter writing was expressly forbidden, though the monastic rules of this period are very concerned about monks interacting with the wider world, and there's lots of provisions for what happens if a visitor comes to the monastery, who's allowed to speak to them, this kind of thing. And chapter 54, the Rule of Benedict was influential here in Wearmouth and Jarrow, and chapter 54 says that monks are just not allowed to send and receive letters unless the abbot says so. So those are just things to bear in mind when thinking about Bede as a letter writer. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay. Right, start to bring this towards the end. I want to talk about this specific letter exchange between Acca and Bede. Acca's letter to Bede is extremely important, as I've already mentioned, because it's the only recipient letter of Bede's to survive intact, and it's also important because we have both sides of the letter exchange. It's a highly stylised act of correspondence, as you'll see in a moment once we get into the nitty-gritty of what they're doing. So it's not like the Walter letter talking about episcopal administration stuff. It's much more kind of stylised and very theological, actually. Acca was Bede's bishop. He was Bishop of Hexham from 710 to 731, very close friend of Bede, and became a crucial patron of his writings and a conduit for their wider dissemination throughout Northumbria and elsewhere as well. He was closely connected with Bishop Wilfrid. He was Bishop Wilfrid's nominated successor, and just one of his letters survives, the only Latin work of Acca's that's indisputably by him to survive. So it's also a really important letter, really important document for trying to reconstruct something about Acca's life, education, and trying to access who he was. So the letter allows us to corroborate some of the statements about Acca's learning and intellect that were provided by Bede and by Stephen of Ripon, who was Wilfrid's biographer as well. So Acca appears in the life of Wilfrid as a kind of side character. His letter to Bede was written towards the beginning of his time at Hexham, the years 710 to 731, and survives on account of being incorporated into the commentary, Bede's commentary on Luke. So Bede wrote the commentary on Luke because Acca asked him to. Bede didn't want to do it originally, but Acca pressed him and kept asking him, and Bede eventually agrees to do it. And then the letter, Acca's letter imploring Bede to write on Luke, and Bede's response survive together as the twin preface to the commentary. And twin epistolary prefaces are extremely rare. It's quite remarkable, actually. Acca's letter asks Bede, please affix this to the front of your commentary as part of the text. And so he sort of inserts himself into Bede's commentary on Luke. It's very unusual, and it never happens again with Bede. And what we can see in Bede's letter and Acca's letter and Bede's response is Bede and Acca sort of playing off each other. So there's kind of a playfulness about how they're exchanging citations from the Bible or phrases from earlier letters, particularly by Augustine. Acca's letter is quite substantial, 648 words long. Typical length of a letter in this period of the ones that survive from Northumbria, sort of 250 to 300 words. We do get much longer ones. Bede's letter to Egbert is sort of 15 pages of the modern translation. But typically a letter would be 250 to 300 words, something like that. So this is 648 words long. A summary of it is he says, he addresses Bede as brother and fellow priest. He reminds Bede that he would like him to work on the commentary on Luke, and then addresses his various reasons for not fulfilling the request, which Bede had professed modesty. He talked about the difficulty of the task, and he'd also said, I don't need to do this because Ambrose has already done a commentary on Luke and there's no need for another one. Acca then sort of takes apart each one of these excuses in turn and says that everyone should contribute what they can towards furnishing the house of God. Ambrose's work isn't suitable for their audience because they need something a bit simpler in plain style. And the bishop assures Bede that it's fine to produce a new work where earlier works exist, and that it's fine to draw heavily upon those works in doing so. And he cites examples from Augustine and Gregory the Great doing just that. And then the letter ends by challenging an interpretation that Bede had put forth in his commentary on Revelation. So Acca takes him to task and says, please can you explain why you have written this? And it relates to the pairings of the evangelists and their symbols. You picture the Codex Amiatinus, Maestas page, there's posters of it around the museum, where you can see the evangelists and their symbols next to them, so the lion, the eagle, and so on. Bede had come up with a system of pairing them, and Acca had said that's not correct. The pairing should be this way around. And in his response, Bede says, well, actually, I've taken this from Augustine, and so that's what I've been following here. Anyway, right, can I have the next slide, please? So I've got the Latin and the English on the top here. So Acca says, I want the work to be completed by you with help of God, so that those who cannot understand lofty or difficult things through weakness of intellect may readily grasp these explanations in plain style. And there's the demand that he makes. I demand that you place this letter at the head of the commentary to show that you were asked to write on Luke not for any other reason but the grace of fraternal compliance. So this is important as a way of kind of legitimising Acca's role in the creation of, and recording for posterity the patron's role in the creation of a new work. Can I have the next one as well, please? Now, salutations are really important. Here we have a chain of salutations. You've got the Latin at the top with the English underneath. But I need to provide both because you can see the kind of the resonance in how they are kind of copying each other's set phrases and so on. But salutations are really sort of interesting in trying to establish what kind of cultural currents a writer was trying to channel in crafting their letters. In the case of the Acca and Bede correspondence, the salutations are very interesting and very revealing. And to appreciate the formulaic aspects of Acca's letter, it must be sort of, you need to sort of think about the ongoing dialogue. So we've got the two letters connected to the commentary on Luke here at the bottom, but they're also responding to an earlier letter that Bede had sent to Acca that was prefaced to the commentary on Acts just a few years before. And you can see this kind of ongoing dialogue start to emerge. The chain of salutations is as follows. Bede says to Acca, to the most desired and truly blessed Lord in Christ, Acca. Bede sends everlasting greetings in the Lord. Acca responds. To the priest Bede, most revered brother in Christ and fellow priest, Acca sends everlasting greetings in the Lord. And then finally, Bede back to Acca. To Lord Bishop Acca, the most blessed and greatly desired beyond measure, Bede, a humble priest, sends greetings in everlasting God. So you see the formulaic nature of these. There's a very set way, as I mentioned at the start of the paper, of addressing somebody in a letter. Now, both men are fully conversant in the conventions of crafting appropriate epistolary salutations, which means they must have received formal training in letter writing as part of their educations in late 7th century Northumbria, Bede here, and Acca at York. Bede's education was monastic, whereas Acca was educated at an episcopal court, as mentioned in York. All three of these give the recipient's name first in the dative case, and then the sender's name second in the nominative case. And you can see there's some interplay here between them. Acca's use of the phrase "perpetuam in domino salutum" reproduces verbatim the final words of the greeting clause of the letter that Bede had used for his letter concerning the commentary on Acts. That formulation also closes the salutation employed by Wakeberg when writing to Pope Gregory II in the year 716, just a few years after this exchange. The in Deo Aeternam Salutem construction, which Bede introduced the exchange in his reply to Acca, was also an established formula. So it's evident that they were happy to draw on stock phrases such as these, so it's sort of a mix and match process when writing to each other. And the respectful repetition of each other's choices across the correspondence allows them to show that they've been reading each other's letters attentively. It's a mark of respect, but also a way of showing that they had sort of taken note of what was written before. Another example is the use of the superlative reverendissimo, which Acca here uses of Bede, but Bede was subsequently applied back to Acca on more than one occasion. Now the next slide, please. Almost coming towards the end now. Now in this one, this is Acca to Bede. Acca took the very unusual step of twice acknowledging both Bede's priestly status. So Bede is both fellow priest and priest. So he calls Bede the priest and fellow priest Bede the priest. Okay, so he repeats it twice. And the reason for doing this, and next slide please, is because Acca is consciously reusing an earlier salutations of Augustine's. So this is Augustine's letter to Hilary that was written in the early 5th century. And you can see it's in Latin on the slide, but I'll give you it in English. To the most blessed Lord and venerable brother in the truth of Christ and fellow priest Hilary, Augustine sends greetings in the Lord. And you can see from the highlighted text there how similar these are in their original Latin form. So Acca is drawing upon the technique of reusing an earlier salutation. And the interesting thing is that this was a very well-known letter of Augustine's, and Bede would have known this letter and would probably have recognised the inference. So Acca is situating their correspondence in shortly after the year 710 in light of this earlier exchange of letters between Augustine and Hilary from late antiquity. So there's all kinds of important resonances there, and it's a sort of a framing device for the communication that's taking place in the present day. And further analysis of Acca's letter reveals that their epistolary practices were similar in many respects. Can I have the next slide as well, please? There's a degree of harmony, and again, apologies for all of the Latin, but I just want to point out here that this is Acca to Bede at the top and Bede to Acca at the bottom. Acca mentions this phrase in the middle, caritas omnia sustanet, and in Bede's reply, in the first line of the exordium, so not the salutation, but the first line of the exordium, mentions caritas, it says caritas omnia credit omnia sperat, and if you give me the next slide as well, please. These are citations from 1 Corinthians 13, and you can see that they are from the same part of 1 Corinthians 13. So what you've effectively got here is Bede and Acca trading citations with each other. So Bede is responding to the biblical, it's not cited as the Apostle Paul says, it's kind of just woven into the Latin, into the text. But Bede is showing Acca that he's spotted it and replying in like manner. And again, it's a shame we don't have more exchanges because this kind of practice was probably very common across the correspondence of this time. But often we only have the one letter, so we can't see how these things were picked up on. In this case, we can see that. Okay, slide please. So, conclusions. Just 2 more slides and then I'm done. I apologise, I might run 2 or 3 minutes over the 50, but we're almost there. With Bede and Acca, I've got 2 slides. One is the conclusions for the Bede and Acca stuff, and one is more general. With regards to Bede and Acca, you can see, if you study their letters closely, that they are picking up on each other's stylistic traits. They're very similar in how they write letters, and they're exchanging these salutation formula phrases. They're exchanging scriptural citations and so forth. So it gives us a rare insight into how correspondence worked for Bede when writing and receiving letters exchanging letters with his friends and contacts. We have a conscious engagement with earlier epistolary traditions, but they're deploying them in a creative manner. Again, so much of the culture of Northumbria at this time, it's a real melting pot of different influences. It's very consciously echoing cultural channels like Roman influence, for example, or late antique influence, sometimes Byzantine influence. But it's always being redeployed in a manner that is uniquely Northumbrian and is distinctive to the culture of this particular region of the world. Okay? And that's true of the letter writing as well. It's taking earlier ideas, moulding them into something new to create something very interesting and quite remarkable. And we've got these words and phrases being used across the letters to recall those earlier exchanges and to set the dialogue between these different Bede and his recipients, sort of reconstruct, sort of making them into new, continuing the tradition of those church fathers, okay? And equating them with them. And sometimes the choices made can be really, really revealing. The letter to Plague One, which concerns heresy, the Bede begins that with a statement from Ephesians, which is all about, which is really sort of pointed. It's about Christology, and so it's relevant to what the ensuing controversy detailed in the letter. And then the last slide, please. So general conclusions, just to bring this to a close. Letter's a really important part of Bede's legacy. I hope I've shown that and managed to convince you of that today. They show a different side of him and his scholarship. Sending a letter was not an everyday occurrence. Okay, I think obviously a lot of letters have been lost, but we also, this cannot have been something that was done all the time, every day. I think it must have been a special occurrence because of the practicalities that were involved. If we study Bede through his letters, we see the gradual spread of his influence in Northumbria and further afield. The first letter on that white slide that we had near the start, the first letter Bede sent was to Quakebert, who was one of his colleagues in the monastery, future abbot of the monastery, 703. So he starts off by sending letters internally at Weymouth and Jarrow, and by the end he was writing to Bishop Egbert in York. He was sending letters probably to the continent as well, and so his influence grows, and you can track that by seeing the progression of his letters as those documents are revealing. And then finally, just a general reflection, letters can be tricky to work with. They're often formulaic, often only one side of an exchange survives, that's normal, and a great deal has been lost. But they're also extremely revealing about the sort of the written culture of a kingdom like Northumbria in the Middle Ages. And I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.